Between 1607 and 1733, a total of 13 English colonies developed along the Atlantic coast of North America, each receiving their identity by means of a charter. 3 different charters were developed. The first of these colonies was known as the corporate colonies, which were operated by joint stock companies. The second type were known as royal colonies, which were under direct authority of the king. Finally, there were the proprietary colonies, which were under the authority of individuals who were granted charters by the king. Unlike other colonies at the time, the British colonies developed a sense of independence and representative government. The Chesapeake Colonies. In 1632, King Charles subdivided the area that had been the Virginia colony and chartered a new colony on either side of the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. The king established proprietorships rather than granting more colonial charters to joint stock companies. To avoid intolerance of Puritan enemies, a number of English Catholics emigrated to Maryland. Upon their arrival, the Act of Toleration was passed, which granted religious freedom to all Christians. In the late 1600s, resentment against the Catholic proprietor erupted into a brief civil war. In the end, however, the Protestants triumphed and the Act of Toleration was repealed. Virginia. Meanwhile, Virginia struggled with a number of problems in the late 17th century, including a rebellion against the colonial government. Virginia faced economic problems in the sense that low tobacco prices brought hard times to the colonies. Political problems erupted when Sir William Berkeley, the royal governor of Virginia, adopted policies that favored large planters and used dictatorial powers to govern their behalf. Nathaniel Bacon, an impoverished animal farmer, led a rebellion against Berkeley's government. He raised an army of volunteers and in 1676 conducted a series of raids and massacres against the Indian villages on the Virginia frontier. Bacon died of dysentery and the rebel army collapsed. Berkeley brutally suppressed remnants of the insurrection. Bacon's rebellion, however, highlighted 2 long-lasting disputes. One was that sharp class differences existed. 2, colonial resistance to royal control was present. Labor shortages. The Chesapeake colonies grew slowly because of high death rates, disease, and Indian attacks. Inclusively, there was an imbalance between the number of men and women. Labor shortage was also a problem, and the colonists attempted to solve this with indentured servitude, the headright system, and slavery. Indentured servitude involved a contract with a master or landowner who paid for the servant's passage and provided him or her with room and board in return for their labor. The headright system involved Virginia offering 50 acres of land to either an immigrant who paid for their own passage or a plantation owner who paid for that immigrant's passage. The first Africans to come to Virginia arrived in 1619, aboard the Dutch trader. At first, they weren't very popular, but it was only a matter of time before slavery were to be exploited. Development of New England. Strong religious convictions helped sustain the Puritans in their struggle to establish the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies. At the same time, Puritan leaders were intolerant of those who questioned their principles and banished anyone who defied them from the Bay Colony. These dissidents formed the nucleus for the founding of several colonies in New England, which would ultimately develop into Rhode Island and Connecticut. Rhode Island. Roger Williams went to Boston in 1631 as a respected minister, but he believed that the individual's conscience was beyond the control of any civil or church authority. His teachings placed him in conflict, so he was banished. Rogers fled to Narragansett Bay, where he and a few followers founded the Providence in 1636. This new colony was unique in the sense that it recognized the rights of Native Americans and provided complete religious freedom. Another descendant who questioned the doctrines was Anne Hutchinson, and she later founded the colony of Portsmouth. In 1644, Roger Williams joined both colonies and created Rhode Island. Connecticut. Connecticut River Valley attracted other settlers who were unhappy with the Massachusetts authorities. Reverend Thomas Hooker led a group of followers into the valley and founded the colony of Hartford in 1636. These settlers created the first written constitution, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. In 1665, New Haven joined the more dramatic Hartford settlers to form the colony of Connecticut. New Hampshire. The last colony to be found in New England was New Hampshire. Hoping to increase royal control over the colonies, King Charles II separated New Hampshire from the Bay colonies in 1639 and made it a royal colony. The Halfway Covenant. In the 1660s, a generation had passed since the founding of the first Puritan colonies in New England. Now, people were less committed to religious faith and more interested in material success. In response to this, the Halfway Covenant was created, which allowed people to take part in church services and activities without making a formal declaration of their total belief in Christ. The New England Confederation. The New England colonies were constantly facing the threat of attack from Native Americans, the Dutch, and the French. Therefore, in 1635, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Hampshire formed a military alliance known as the New England Confederation. The Confederation lasted until 1648 and established a precedent for colonies taking unified action towards a common purpose. The Confederation helped defeat Chief Metacom, or King Philip, and won a war for them, which ended Native American resistance in New England. The Restoration Colonies. New American colonies were founded in the late 17th century during a period in English history known as the Restoration. The Carolinas. As a reward for helping him gain the throne, Charles II granted a huge tract of land between Virginia and Spanish Florida to 8 nobles, who in 1633 converted the land into North and South Carolina. In 1670, in the Southern Carolinas, a few colonists from England and some planters from the island of Barbados founded a town named for their king. The northern part of the Carolinas developed differently. Here, farmers from Virginia and New England established small, self-sufficient tobacco farms. New York. Charles II wished to consolidate the crown's holdings along the Atlantic Ocean and close the gap between New England and the Chesapeake Bay colonies. So in 1644, the king granted his brother, James, the lands lying between Connecticut and Delaware, after he had compelled the Dutch to give it up. James named the land New York and treated the Dutch settlers well and allowed them religious freedom. James ordered new taxes, duties, and rents, but soon taxation without representation ideas sparked, so James created a representative assembly. New Jersey. Believing that the territory of New York was too large to handle, James gave part of the land to Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. To attract settlers, both proprietors made generous land offers and allowed religious freedom. In 1702, the Crown decided to combine the two Jerseys into one single royal colony. Pennsylvania. To the west of New Jersey lay a broad expanse of forested land that was originally settled by the Quakers. The Quakers believed in equality for all men and women. They resisted military service and believed that religious authority was found within each person's private soul and not in the Bible. Thus, Quakers of England were persecuted and jailed for their beliefs. William Penn, a young convert to the Quaker faith, was left with considerable wealth from his father, so he decided to start a new colony, Pennsylvania. Delaware. In 1702, Penn granted the lower 3 counties of Pennsylvania their own assembly. Due to this, Delaware was created as a separate colony. Georgia. The last. In 1732, a 13th colony, Georgia, was created. It was both the last of the British colonies and also the only one to receive direct financial support from the home government in London. Wealthy philanthropists thought Georgia would relieve the overcrowded jails as settlers could be shipped to this colony and start life over. Mercantilism and the Empire. Most European kingdoms in the 17th century adopted the economic policy of mercantilism, which looked upon trade, colonies, and the accumulation of wealth as the basis for a country's military and political strength. Colonies were to provide raw materials to the parent country for the growth and power of that country. They were created to enrich the parent country. Acts of trade and navigation. England's government implemented a mercantilist policy with a series of navigation acts, which established 3 rules for the colonial trade. 1. Trade to and from the England colonies could be carried only by the English. 2. All goods imported to the colonies could pass only through ports in England. 3. Specified goods from the colonies could be exported to England only. These acts had both positive and negative effects on the colonies. They were positive because New England shipbuilding prospered, Chesapeake Tobacco had a monopoly in England, and English military forces protected the colonies. They were negative because colonial manufacturing was severely limited, Chesapeake farmers received low prices for their crops, and colonists had to pay high prices for manufactured goods from England. In many respects, mercantilist regulations were unnecessary, since England would have been the colony's primary trading partners anyway. The institution of slavery. Even more important than mercantilism was the growing institution of slavery. Numbers were growing rapidly, and demand increased because of 3 main reasons. Reduced migration, the colonies developed a dependable workforce, and slaves were cheap labor, and the colonies were in utter need for their plantations. Slave laws. White colonists started to create slave laws to ensure bondage for life and that their slaves would be inherited by their children. Massachusetts was the first colony to recognize these slave laws. The triangular trade. In the 17th century, a single company had monopolized English trade in African slaves. Merchant ships would regularly follow a triangular or 3-part trade route. First, a ship loaded with barrels of rum would start out from a New England port and would be traded for hundreds of captive Africans. Second, the ship set out on a horrendous middle passage. Africans who survived would be traded as slaves in the West Indies for a cargo of sugar cane. Third, the ship would return to a New England port where the sugar cane would be sold to be used in making rum.